Moving along, now we're going to look at the first 8 measures of Etude number 14 in the key of D major. Let's get going. Wow, that's a lot of notes, right? Don't get overwhelmed by thinking about all the notes you have to play. Today we're only going to look at the first 25%, 8 measures. And we're going to look through all of the aspects together to practice and perfect and slowly build good foundations for learning the entire etude. So let's focus on the first 8 measures, shall we? Those are the first 8 measures of Etude number 14, and I played them today at 80 beats a minute. That's not a tempo that will make all state, but it's a good tempo to build foundations for later in the fall semester. Look carefully, there's a lot of marks on the page. We're going to go through them together, of course. The first step is to establish a vocabulary for this composition, and that's the D major scale. So the D major scale has 2 sharps, F sharp and C sharp. Refer to the introduction video regarding the fingerings for high C sharp and D. So we are going to practice it today, slurred and tongued. Let's start with slurred, 2 octaves. Tongued, 2 octaves. You'll notice both this etude and etude number 11 have the exact same range, low D to high D. This is the only year in which oboe players don't have to play one of the screaming high notes, high E flat, E or F. Good news, the rhythm doesn't change. So measures 1 through 8, we're playing straight 16th notes completely. There happens to be, though, 2 small exceptions. Let's look at the beginning. Normally we would count 1 E and A, but we have a 16th rest at the beginning. E and A. Notice it occurs exactly after the beat. Instead of 1 E and A or 2 E and A, 2 is left out. It's the missing 16th rest that should have been written in at the beginning. E and A. Practice along with me. I will say it once and then you say it. Let's go back and forth. Ready? E and A. E and A. So you've got to get used to practicing in time with a metronome. Finally, we have a slight variation on the rhythm at the end of measure 8 where we will play 1 E and A 2. Notice the music in front of you at the screen doesn't have that missing section, but if you look at the entire etude, the rhythm is 2/16, 8th note, 16th rest, and 3/16 notes. Composite rhythm for the entire measure 8 is 1 E and A 1. Now let's talk about phrasing and breathing. You'll need a very deep breath at the beginning because there's no place to bail out. You will have to play all 8 measures in one breath. So take an extremely deep breath at the beginning, slowly. I would recommend you practice with the met, always, of course, and think breathe, E and A 1. So breathe in, 2, 3, E and A. So let's try it together. You'll say it and I'll play it. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Now you count and I'll just intake air. Ready? That gives you plenty of time, and it will also slow your heart rate down a little bit if you're a little nervous at the performance. So remember, you will have to play all 8 measures in one breath. There's no place to bail. Now let's look at the basic approach to learning this difficult technique. The summary of this would be play 1 measure plus 1 note at a time. At the beginning, include the pickup notes. The pickup notes are not a complete measure, so we'll call it measure 0. We're going to start with measure 0, measure 1, and the first note of measure 2, like this. You can go slower than that for your initial practice, say down to 60. Practice one measure plus a note so you get out of the habit of stopping at a bar line. Once you feel like you have one measure plus a note very well under your fingers and controlled and relaxed, try two. Skip ahead and start at measure 2 and play 2 bars, etc., etc. Then go to 4 measures at a time, finally all 8 measures. It will build confidence, it will build muscle memory, and it will also keep you from being anxious about seeing all those notes. Start at a slow tempo. This metronome is set at 66, but even 60 beats a minute is not too slow. It doesn't matter where you start. Find a tempo at which you will be successful. You'll notice at the beginning there's a mezzo forte, but there are no other markings. In actual practice, a musician does not play a long section static or neutral in volume. So let's add a couple of places. The first one will be at measure 2. We'll add a little bit of a decrescendo. A little decrescendo. Now, you'll notice in measure number 4, the arpeggio has the same contour, goes down and up, but it's higher. That's a great place to add a little bit of a crescendo. So here's measure 4. Notice the high B natural is kind of a goal, and you'll notice I have it circled for that reason. That's where we're headed. That's really going to be the loudest spot in the etude. And if you look carefully at 5, 6, and 7, 5, 6, and 7 really are the following notes. Notice it's just a descending scale, and I have notes that are circled with arrows leading to the next one. We refer to that in the professional music world as a sequence. It's the same idea, repeating down one step in this case. So where should you begin your practice with the metronome? The answer is as slow as it takes to play it extremely well. I actually started way back at 60 beats a minute or even slower. So here's 60 beats a minute. That's pretty easy, right? But that's the whole idea. Play it at a tempo that you can play relaxed with a good sound and not have to worry. Then in your journaling, write that tempo down. I went from 60 to, and only do small increases. Anytime you feel tension, wrong notes, or awkward fingers, go back to a slower tempo and repeat until you feel confident and relaxed. Even by late August or September, 70 beats a minute is not too slow. Now, by the time you get to all region, most of the players who are going to go to all region will be playing this music at about 80 to 85 beats a minute with no missed notes, comfortable sound, good tone quality. All state, probably somewhere between 92 to 100 beats a minute. But for right now, whatever speed you can play it comfortably. That's your, what I call, default tempo, meaning I can always play it at X. Start at your default tempo. All right, let's look at the arpeggios used in this excerpt. Measures 1 through 8 only have 2 arpeggios, the D major and what's called the A7 chord, so named because there's a 7th, a 4th note in the arpeggio. Let's start with D major. First, let's go low to high, D, F sharp, A, D, F sharp, A. That's the basic vocabulary, right? Now let's take a look at it as it appears in the music. Measure 2, it moves downward and up. Remember, always practice one measure plus a note. The next D major arpeggio has the same idea, right? A measure plus a note. Finally, the A7. Don't forget C sharp. Super important. It's okay to mark it if you want. It's in the key, but it's not something we play every day unless you're used to orchestra music. We'll see some other arpeggios later in this composition. Even at your default tempo, pay attention to the differing articulations so that you don't get bad habits as part of your practice. So let's take a look at measure number 1. Both beats have the same articulation. Slur 3, tongue 1. Okay, that's not too bad. But now let's look at measure 5. We have slur 3 and the rest are tongued. I do occasionally hear students at all region play dee-ah-ha-dee-dee-ah-da-da. That was measure 1. That's not measure 5. So let's look at measure 5. The good news is 5 and 6 have the same articulation. So part of the practice is looking for patterns where things repeat or establish themselves. 5 and 6 not only have that sequence of pitches, but they have the same articulation. Slur 3, tongue 5, slur 3, tongue 5. Finally, measure 7. Really awkward because we take the slur 3 and we flip it, and the first beat of measure 7 is tongue, then slur 3. So I like to go back and do the following. Focus on the odd articulation moments. Measure 1. Measure 5 and 6. 7. Finally, I'd like to mention, even though this excerpt starts at the middle of measure 8, that's where it stops, at the middle of measure 8. Eventually, once you learn it, you should probably go on and play the last part of measure 8 to get used to the contrast. You'll notice there's not time enough for a breath, really. You'll actually take a big breath later in the composition. Once again, let's look at measure 8, the entire measure. Don't feel like you have to play it super soft, but the end of measure 8 is definitely contrasting with the first 8 measures. Okay, let's talk about building tone and intonation on this excerpt. Good news is there are many A naturals. So let's start with A natural. Just a comfortable sound, letting the reed resonate. Then try it with a tuner. Finally, the high octave A. Think resonance before you try to put vibrato in. Let the reed resonate. And then if your throat is relaxed, some vibrato will come through naturally. Now, intonation. Many oboe players play sharp, let's face it. Some of it has to do with that we like to play on old reeds because we know what they can do, not realizing they've already passed their prime. Old reeds play sharp. They're more closed and more resistant. Many oboe players play high notes sharp. So think about keeping your throat open, especially on high notes. It's not something you should have to pinch for at all. It's just a differing air stream direction. When I play the super high notes like C sharp and D, my airstream is aimed upward, but I'm not pinching at all. Keeping my throat and mouth open will keep you from playing sharp. It's unusual to find oboe players playing flat. When that happens, it's usually a new reed or a reed that needs some more work on it. At the audition, you're allowed to play one starting note. Since the first note of the etude is A, and A is a stable note for the oboe, play A for your first note. Take a slow, deep breath. Make that note memorable. You're telling the judges, hey, this is what I sound like. And then you're ready to think your tempo and play in speed. Journal your progress. Every day you must practice, and you must practice with a met. Use your journal to see where you have come from and where you're going. Think about 60 beats a minute. as an initial tempo. It's not too slow. You want to build up good habits and make sure you have the correct notes and correct articulation from the beginning. This is the end of part 1 and the end of this video. Remember, you're going to be going on a long journey. The all-region process is something that takes several months of practice, and the December audition should just be another opportunity to run through the music again. The next video will concentrate on the etudes, the second and third parts. I'll see you there. Welcome or welcome back. This part of the video covers part 2 of the etude number 14 in D major, part of the ATSSB All-Region Etudes for Oboe for fall 2023. Let's take an overview of the entire etude. It's got a lot of notes, 32 measures long, and we're going to be looking at a huge part of the middle, measures 9 through 22, which consists of 2 very long phrases. Let's hear what it should sound like. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of this section, let's review the vocabulary necessary to play this etude, and that's the D major scale. So if you have not warmed up yet, this is a good opportunity to review the D major scale. You will need a 2-octave range, and we have to play high C sharp and high D, slurred and tongued. So let's go over the D major scale quickly, slurred and tongued. The rhythms for this section, of course, are not complicated. They're all 16th notes, but we have this unusual pickup note going to measure 9. So let's turn on a metronome gently. And you'll notice those 3 pickup notes occur starting on the E, the second 16th of the beat. E and up. Say it with me. Ready? 1, 2, ready, and E and up. Now try playing that with the metronome. I'll demonstrate. You should be able to do it several times in a row to build both confidence and also ensure that you're playing exactly in time. Once you do that, go back to the beginning of measure 8 and play the entire measure plus 1 note. I practice this measure myself many times a day. And you too will need to practice both the pickups to measure 9 and all of measure 8 and the first note of measure 9 many times. You really are not going to have time for much of a breath. Don't count on taking a deep breath there. The judges will not react favorably to students who play sha-pa-pee, ba-da-pa-pop. It's just a 16th rest. There's no time for a big breath there. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this section involves 2 very long phrases. Let's take a look at the breathing in the middle. So there's a breath in the middle at the beginning of measure 14. Now you'll notice on the music that's put on the top of this slide that there is a parentheses, a retardando marked. I do that because that will telegraph to the judges, hey, I intended to breathe there. And yes, it's marked, but it seems very abrupt just to play sha-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da, beat-up-up-up, beat-up-up-up. I'm going to try both ways and I'll show you what I'm talking about. In context with all of the music, it's perfectly acceptable to retard slightly before this breath. And the judges will not have a problem with it because it's consistent with the musicality of the phrase in the middle of the composition. Now, at the end of this section, when we get over to measure 22, 21 and 22, we have the same issue. We have a breath coming up after the first note of the measure. Literally, it's played like this. Straight 16th notes. But it's okay, again, to retard slightly at the end of that measure. And then take a deep breath and go right on. Now, when you practice it with a metronome, you will be off with the metronome. Don't worry too much about it. Start with the metronome to get the tempo in your head, and then jump back in after you take a deep breath and try to continue in the speed that you were doing beforehand. Now let's take a look at, of course, the most difficult part, drilling the technical aspects of it. So we would start with 1 bar plus a note. So let's take a look at the pickup to 9, and let's play 9, 10 plus a note. Now, of course, comes the most challenging part, drilling the technique. We'll start by doing basically 1 bar at a time. So let's start by reviewing the pickup to measure 9, and then 1 note. Open throat, open oral cavity, gentle embouchure on the reed. That's the embouchure and oral cavity you're going to use for all of the measures that have the arpeggios marked. So one more time, let's take a look at the low D. Now let's play the first note of each of those bars and play the low D immediately afterwards. We should be with our mouth and our air thinking and doing the low D all the time. Once you're able to play the first note plus the low D, then go back and drill the entire arpeggio plus 1 note. Don't go on to the next one until you've had several successful attempts at each arpeggio, the D major and the G major. Now let's look at measures 14 and 15. Those 2 measures are all based on A major arpeggio, but there's a lot of jumping around. So let's go back and play 1 small section at a time, starting with the high C sharp. Of course, there's a big pattern to it. It's always slur 2, tongue 2. And you'll notice every 4-note pattern goes downward. Please keep in mind that many students without either private lessons or consistent practice tend to clip the slurs, and that will sound like this. And you can see that's not very musical. In art music and in the professional world, slurs are not clipped unless the composer marks it specifically with a dot at the end of the slur. There are no dots at the end of the slurs here. So make a point to play the end of the slur its full value. Once you're able to do each of those patterns smoothly and without tension, try putting 2 together. Once you're able to play all of them together, then work on the dynamic changes from a loud dynamic to a moderately soft dynamic. Okay, and here is the last of those 4 sections that are going to be spliced together. Once you're able to do all of the 3 previous items, start working on the technique by playing 2 measures at a time plus 1 note. Here's an example, measures 19, 20, and the first note of 21. Please note, I only slowed down that time just for demonstration purposes. Once you're able to play 2 bars at a time plus a note, you're then at the stage where you've built up enough confidence you can play through 4 or even 8 measures at a time. This section has a lot of notes, but also is hard for mental fatigue. So watch out, be focusing during your practice, and don't be in a hurry. Now let's look at some opportunities to add a few extra dynamics to shape phrases. There are many dynamics already present in this section, but let's look at three little areas we can add some interest. Measure 9 is one of them, where we can add a little crescendo followed by a little diminuendo. Now let's jump over to measure 17. Measure 17, we should probably put a little bit of a crescendo in there. The overall line does rise in pitch, and it would be natural to add a small crescendo. In fact, you could even imagine the crescendo that's printed in the music of measure 18. You could think of it as starting in 17, and that would be perfectly okay. It's not a huge crescendo. And notice, Ferling does not tell us how loud he expected you to get. It's just a crescendo mark. So I put mezzo forte as a guide. Your private instructor may have differing ideas. Finally, let's take a look at measure 21. We again have a rising line that would work nicely with a small crescendo. Here are measures 20 and 21 together. Keeping in mind we had a breath there, and so it's okay to have a small retard right before the breath. There are a lot of odd articulation patterns in this excerpt. Practice initially one measure at a time so that you ingrain a good habit of the correct articulation. As you probably know, if you learn an articulation pattern incorrectly, it's very difficult to change it. Also, consider the staccato markings. Staccato does not mean short in Italian, it means detached. So use a light tongue throughout. So to give you an example, I'm going to play measures 16 and 17. Let's talk for a moment about building tone and intonation, specifically through this section. Most of the notes that we want to listen to and that the judge will listen to are A's and D's. So let's review A and D as a long tone. Here's tuning A, also known as A4. Check it with the tuner, see if there's any difference. The D below it, called D4. Once you've checked your A and your D, compare octaves. Most oboe players play a little sharp, and especially at an audition. Remember, the best way to combat sharpness is to think as a fundamental an open oral cavity and not take too much reed in the mouth. Practice long tones every day to build confidence and build good tone quality. If you saw the introduction video, you know that I have a journal and that I journal every day what I practiced, what was the tempo or tempi, multiple tempos, and also how I felt or what was the reaction to my performance that day. Did I feel good? Did I feel like I made progress? Was I frustrated? And if so, why? Journal your progress so that you will see that you have made definite strides toward the goal of your all-region audition, and also will give you a sense of accomplishment to show how much you've gotten done. This is the end of Etude number 14, part 2. Let's go on now to the concluding section of Etude number 14.
Hello and welcome back. This is the third part of my video series on the ATSSB Etude number 14 in D major for 2023. Let's look at the concluding section of this etude. There are only two rhythm issues in this concluding section. One is measure 22. The music you see in front of you takes place after the first 16th note, and there's a breath. So we have to think E and a 2, E and a 1. So let's try that with a metronome. Ready? And. E and a 2, E and a 1. Now let's try playing it. 1, 2, ready, and. And then finally the last measure. The last measure has this sextuplet rhythm on the downbeat. So there's 2 triplets per beat. In this tempo would be triplet, triplet, 2. That's the last measure's counting. Be careful also of articulation, which I'll take a look at later. Now a word about phrasing and breathing. Both at the beginning of measure 22 and at the beginning of measure 28, there are breath marks, and you will absolutely need them. So this concluding section of the etude is based on 2 phrases, and you will need to take the breath marks as advertised. Make sure you have plenty of air for the ending of the etude. Once again, we'll take a very fundamental approach to learning the technique. 1 measure plus a note. You have the semi-chromatic scale in measure 22, and then let's take a look at 23, straight 16th notes, but mixed up articulation. The hard measures, of course, are 24 and 29, and I can assure you, I've spent a lot of time with those 2 measures as well. Let's take a look at 24 especially. First of all, we can tell right away that 24 is based on a little chromatic notion. Start with playing that until you have those fingers really kind of memorized, and then add one of the A's at a time. Two A's. And keep adding A's until you're very comfortable. Now, of course, here comes 29, the hardest one of all. The first part of our technical challenge is going to be that we've got to make sure the low D speaks. Now, let's set it up by going back to 28 and playing to that low D, 28 to 29. Once you're able to do that and get the low D to speak every time with a good sound, go through and play the scale that's at the bottom of measure 29. D, E, F sharp, D, and then G. Again, don't worry too much about staccato at this stage. We're talking about getting notes to speak with a good tone quality. Now try separating those bottom scale notes in 29. And then go back and apply the same idea that we did with measure 24. Add one of the high notes at a time. The judges will not be able to tell exactly the intonation on the C natural unless you play very sharp. Instead, everybody's going to be listening for the bom, 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 bom. That's the real melody going on. Focus your embouchure. Focus the opening of your mouth and your airstream toward playing that low note. Finally, let's take a look at the next 2 measures coming up. We have this very odd chromatic scale. Let's make sure we're playing that correctly. D, A sharp or B flat, B natural, F sharp, G, D sharp or E flat to E natural. And that will have to be practiced many, many times. Notice all the half steps in there. The next to the last bar, I've marked some arpeggios for you. You'll notice there's a D major arpeggio with an extra note, B, A, F sharp, D, A7 arpeggio, C sharp, A, G, E, D. Slowly, try it slurred first. Be careful. The technique in this section is the trickiest of the entire etude. You'll be spending probably half of your practice time, technically speaking, on this section. The concluding section of the etude has a lot of staccato markings. Instead, think about tonguing light. It's very, very easy to allow the throat to close up and the tone to become pinched or difficult to tongue the low notes and high notes. in this section. You'll notice if you look at it, you've got staccato notes that have to be tongued from the low D to the high D. So go back instead, slur everything one measure at a time if possible, and then think legato tongue, and then as you increase speed, think light tongue. To build our tone quality, let's take a look at two very good notes that will work well. One of them is the low D. That should be our focus. There's a number of low Ds in this section. Compare it then with the D above it, D5. Finally, compare D5 to the high D. The intervals should sound true to your ears, the octaves. Those are the notes that the judge will hear the most. So work on your Ds and getting a good tone quality, especially on the low one. Most student oboe players play sharp on the high D. So make sure that you're always using, for high D, both the right hand middle finger and the low C key. I'd like to remind you to journal your progress so that you can look back with pride on all the things you've accomplished during the late summer and the fall. Learning the all-region etudes is a process of discovery, and it's a long process. Be patient with yourself and allow yourself time to grow. And above all, practice every day. I hope that this video has helped you in learning the all-region etude number 14 for this year for ATSSB. If I can be of service to you, please contact me at the email or phone number listed on the last slide. Good luck.